Everybody. So this week we're going to be looking at chapter 13, States and Cultures in East Asia, from 800 to 1400. What are we looking at here? The Song Dynasty in China, maybe the Tang. We'll be looking at Japan. We'll briefly touch on the Mongols a little bit, how the Mongols in China. The medieval age, the medieval era, we've looked at it in Europe, we've looked at it in India, we'll look at the medieval era here in China. We'll do that. Anyway, so we'll look at that. And it looks like it might be the Yuan Dynasty, not the Tang Dynasty, maybe. Anyway, so let's get started with that. All right, the medieval Chinese economic revolution from 800 to 1100. So, hey, it was the Tang. I was right. So it's the Tang, the Song, then the Yuan. So Chinese dynasties evolve. Typically, Chinese dynasties, all the ways back to the beginning of history, have evolved through a predictable cycle of early strength, great prosperity, eventual decline, usually an era of war and civil war and chaos, and then it starts all over again. And we've done this by this time period half a dozen times already, going back, a couple thousand years. This is simply the dynastic cycle in China. It is the way it's been. There were, I don't know, it's hard. Historians debate it, but there's certainly been at least half a dozen, maybe even 10 or more, really great dynasties that have usually lasted several centuries. Then the period of decline, war, strife, and then it starts again. This is the dynastic cycle. It was also the case with the Tang and the Song and the Yuan, with all of them. The Tang Dynasty fell in 907 officially, but you have to understand that when a dynasty falls, that's basically when it's over. By the time a dynasty falls, it has probably been in decline for a century, Outside influences, losing economic power, losing territory, losing wars, until eventually it just collapses. This was probably due to the Uyghur Turks, the outside influence of the Uyghur Turks, probably in the 800s, probably. All right, with this fall, the Song Dynasty comes to power after again another period of war and violence. You see a period there of civil war, violence, strife. Sometimes we call it a warring states period of about 53 years, give or take. An entire lifetime of war and strife before a new dynasty brings peace to China once again. They take advantage of an increasing population. By this point in time, China's population is probably the greatest in the world, probably greater than any other place. India is maybe close, but put it in perspective, the population of China is probably equal to the population of the entirety of Europe. All of the states and kingdoms and parts of Europe all together, probably the same or even fewer people than just China alone. I mean, Europe has cities of hundreds of thousands, a couple. China has multiple cities of millions, even over 2 million. So, yeah, I mean, China is a whole order of magnitude greater than anything that Europe has individually. Increasing economy, increasing population, of course, fuels this increasing power and size. Agricultural prosperity also was due probably to a new type of agriculture known as wet field rice production. Now, rice had been produced in southern China regularly. Hopefully I have that right. Southern China had been produced regularly, but they come up with a new type of way to produce it, which actually increases the production of rice several times, making it far more productive and able to grow or able to sustain a much greater and faster growing population. Well over 100 million, 150 million population by this time period we're talking about. As a matter of fact, by the end of this time period, by the 1400s, it may already be close to 200 million population by the 1400s. Much greater than any other place in the world. We have an expanded commercialization of the economy. We have expanded state ownership of these agricultural facilities. Facilities, that's the wrong word. Agricultural properties, agricultural production. There's nothing industrialized about it, so I don't want to use that facilities word. There's no industrialization really. There's industrialization in the cities a little bit, which we'll talk about. We see expanded business and trade having to do with this much growing part of the economy, which agriculture was the greatest part of the economy in China, pretty much to modern times. Economic trade opportunities abound. There's a lot of wealth, although we do see the wealth generally concentrated in the upper echelon of society, as we see everywhere. Nothing really different there. We do now have paper money. Money was now so there was so much money available now. There was so much wealth available, even though it was concentrated in the upper classes, that you simply can't carry around coins all the time anymore. So copper coins had been a common coinage before this a common currency. And so we see the weight of it, of course. Yeah, when they start actually switching over to paper money in this time period, the government was probably producing millions and millions of copper coins every year. Simply was too bulky. To make payments from cities, tax payments to the lords would sometimes take entire wagonfuls, which of course would also be a prime target for bandits and thievery. As opposed to if you have paper money, you can put it in a very small package and hide it, and it is just as valuable as an entire wagon load full of copper coins. Much, much harder to steal, much easier to transport. Made a lot of sense. They're not the first ones. Potentially Korea might have been the first place to actually produce paper money, or come up with paper production, but China quickly follows suit because at this point in time, Korea is, give or take, sometimes Korea is part of China or a vassal state of China, but the connection between Korea and China is pretty common, and pretty consistent all the way through modern times. Foreign trade increases dramatically all the way through Southeast Asia, Egypt, the Middle East, Persia, Africa, India, pretty much all across what we would call the eastern part of the world. We see this trade. China is the wealthiest, most prosperous nation on earth in this time period, hands down. Now, that doesn't mean people enjoyed this. The vast majority of people were poor, common farmers. But that doesn't mean the money wasn't there. It's just the money was concentrated in the hands of the few. Again, the way it usually is. Nothing unusual here. New shipping technologies is one of the things that really made all this possible. We have new ships. China has the largest ships in the world. Matter of fact, their ships are almost 10 times bigger than your typical ship. And they're several times bigger than the largest ships, like 3 times bigger than the largest ships the Europeans even have. So they have these huge ships which can, of course, carry massive amounts of agricultural goods and treasure and silk and other things to trade with ports all across Asia and into Africa, India, the Red Sea. Really wonderful, really helped. New oars, new sails, new types of bulkheads. Why watertight bulkhead even matters? The bulkhead is sort of the lower supports of the ship. Pretty much the bottom parts of the ship. Why watertight? Because the more watertight it is, the more cargo you can carry because it sinks deeper into the water. It has a bigger draft, is what it's called. And the further it sinks in the water, the more water pressure, which means if the bulkheads aren't watertight, they're going to leak. And of course, leaking means the ship would sink. Leaking could damage the product on board the ship. So the better technology allows the ships to be bigger, carry more goods, be heavier, sink deeper in the water, and still be safe. And of course, the compass. Europeans sometimes take the credit for this, but no, the compass was invented by the Chinese as well. Yeah, all kinds of new technologies for sea travel, carry more goods, etc. Another thing which adds to this is the beginnings of industrial production. This is the first country in the world which really enters into the Industrial Revolution, centuries before we see it in Europe. It's really interesting. We're going to talk about that here in this chapter, especially with the Song and the Yuan. The Song and the Yuan dynasty were actually in a place to control the world economy. They were actually poised to dominate the world's economy and the world's oceans. Instead, Europeans do it. But China was there first. China had writing, had paper. China had printing presses. China had paper currency. China had bigger production, bigger ships. They were literally ahead of the entire world in everything economically. Really, they were. Well ahead of Europe. Why didn't they become the ones to dominate and colonize the world instead of Europeans did it? Well, we're going to talk about that. They were the first ones in the world to enter into an industrial revolution with mass industrial production, iron production, mass production techniques, including production of military goods, industrial goods, agricultural goods, farm products. They had the first farm machines in the fields, even though there's no automation. Don't get me wrong, but it's the first metal machines in the fields that are being pulled by people, horses, ox, that are used to do the work of men. They did this centuries before Europeans did any type of stuff. Yeah, and this was almost 1,000 years ago. So these folks were entering an industrial revolution, give or take, 500 years ahead of Europe. Really, they were poised to, they could have probably conquered the world. Probably. They were centuries ahead of anyone else in the world as far as industrial economic production. I'm not saying they were ahead at everything, and whether it be science or learning or math, I'm not saying they're ahead in every field. When it comes to industrialization, economic production, they were ahead of everybody. Military production, production of ships and weapons, ahead of everyone else. Um, Poised to really conquer the world had it really wanted to do that. All this prosperity leads to our large urban centers. We see dozens of cities across China with hundreds of thousands of population, and we see a couple of cities like Kaifeng and Hangzhou by the end of this time period approaching a 2 million population, several times larger than anything Europe has. Pretty crazy, really. Now, this revolution really made lots of men rich. Not so much women. China was a patriarchal, male-dominated society, as pretty much everywhere was. So we see many, many people becoming rich and wealthy off of this. Lots of surplus goods to make profits. Production of paper and sugar and tea and iron and, yes, steel as well. That's not a mistype there, in case you're wondering about steel. You realize mass production in steel in Western civilization doesn't really happen until the 1800s. Even the late 1800s, we see mass production of steel. 800 years earlier, China's producing steel. I'm not saying they're mass producing it. I'm not saying they're building skyscrapers and shit with it. I'm just saying they're already producing steel 500 years before Europeans even know what steel is. And it's even centuries after that before Europeans learn how to mass produce steel. And Americans learn how to do it. And China's already doing this almost 1,000 years ago. Most of these results, all this prosperity went to the hands of men. It did. Not unusual. Women certainly weren't as grand. We do see increased wealth, increased city size. We do see an increasing demand in women for not the good stuff. We see a mass increase of women for prostitution, sex slaves, courtesans. We see a dramatic increase in women being sold, farmers selling their daughters. This becomes a common practice in agricultural communities to sell off your daughters into slave labor, sexual slave labor, or factory work. Europeans do something sort of like this. It's not quite as draconian, but Europeans have their own version of pretty much giving their daughters away to factory work. But again, they don't do that for another 500 years that we see Europeans start to do that. In the end, China's prosperity increases. It is better in general for all people in general. greater economic profit, greater life expectancy, greater prosperity in general. Although it needs to be clear, this prosperity does not necessarily translate to the masses of agricultural workers, which is what most Chinese people were agricultural workers. Most of this modernization, we might use the term, is just in the urban centers, the highly populated urban centers of 100,000 plus, of which China has dozens. Um, yeah, China has more large cities than Europe. Just China alone has more large cities than all of Europe combined. Pretty crazy, honestly. Um, Here we have Europe over here. Look at the size. I don't know if this is necessarily proper scale map. We do have lots of issues with maps being done to proper scale, especially when the Western civilization makes them. We often sometimes see maps that are not necessarily appropriate, that show Europe bigger than it is. But here it shows Europe pretty small, actually. China. So realistically, if you look at square mileage, China is almost the size of Europe. You take out all this water around Europe, and the actual square land miles, China is probably about the same. Probably about the same as Europe, or close to it. India certainly is misrepresented on here. India is actually bigger than Europe in reality. Here it looks like it's considerably, well, not considerably smaller, but definitely smaller. And of course, Africa in reality is much, much bigger than this. If this were an actual proportional map, Africa would probably be 3 times this size, truthfully. Anyway, it gives you an idea of this is trade routes, 7th century, Central Asia, 9th century, they're moving outside of Asia. By the 16th century, they're traveling all the way to Europe, around the world. 17th century, they're going everywhere. And by this point in time, they're actually crossing the Pacific. By the 17th, 19th century, they're crossing and going all the way to North America, which in the 19th century, that is the United States, actually traveling over to the US. China was literally poised to dominate the globe. And then some things happen that sort of stops them from doing that. And we'll cover some of that. By the way, it's pretty much all internal. Outside influences come to influence China, but not till later centuries. China stops itself from expanding around the world. They really seem to stop themselves. We'll cover that a little bit. Although more of that might actually be covered in a later chapter, but we'll cover some of it. Interesting, look at this image here. Tea drinking, image of tea drinkers. This is the Song period, a tea making. I guess this looks like almost like a sketch. I don't know exactly what we would call this. A painting, maybe. All right. So this is a tea making and tea drinking, although it does look like maybe, I think it's all combined. I think this is maybe not be like a real, honest, like what it would really look like. I think it's a representational. It's sort of figurative. It shows tea production and also tea consumption. It sort of shows the whole process, how tea is made, produced, ground, and then actually shows tea being prepared, and then it finally shows what tea would actually look like being served. So it sort of puts like 3 different things together to sort of give you a combined image of tea from the production to the preparation to the serving. You see it all. Now, who would get to enjoy this? Well, generally, this is people who would enjoy the tea would be the upper class, the elite, not the common person. What does this sort of say about what was sort of accepted cultural activities for maybe leisured people, for all these people enjoying all the wealth and prosperity of this new economic boom that China sees during the medieval period? Look at the way people are dressed. Look at the colors. The colors in this seem to be very limited, sort of muted colors. You see any religious influence in here, maybe? Some type of religious influence on this society that we might see here in this image that might be obvious. Now, the cost of this is expensive. That's also another thing. What does this say about what type of class of people? What type of class folks would have enjoyed all this? What are the people you see in the image? These four people who are doing the preparation here. What type of folks are those? Think about that. So certainly think about the tea, the process, what it says about leisured, cultured life, what it says about the working class, what value did tea have in their society? Why was it, was it significant? Things like that, and the whole idea of the solemnity of it, how solemn the situation was, and how proper it was, and the procedure, and the way they're dressed, the colors, all that kinds of thing. Just sort of look at the image and see, can you make some type of, based upon what I've explained to you and what you know thus far, what you could read in the book, what does this say about their society? Think about that. Good discussion question. What do we have here? City life. So this also could be a good discussion question. You have here a marketplace. You have a sort of a marketplace, which would have been during this economic prosperity, there have been lots of markets, lots of shops and businesses. You have a canal here. This is a water canal. You have a bridge going over the canal. Look how busy this is. Look at the transportation of goods, the animals, the wagons, all the different shop stalls, the boats, the canals. What does this say about this economic revolution in China, really? What is the purpose of having all these canals and riverways? Why did China spend, so you know, they spent a ton of money creating new waterways, new canals, new riverways. Why do they do it? Because the water's pretty, they wanted more rivers. Why spend a massive amount of money and energy and effort and labor producing all these new waterways and these new canals and bridges and roads? Remember, this is all before railroads, way before railroads. So what is the purpose of all these waterways and canals? And what does it say about all the different shops and businesses here? What does it say about the economy, the market, the trade, the buying and selling of goods? Think about all that. What about all the people? Think about the boats. Some of these boats are huge. Do they run by themselves? No, the boats need workers, hundreds of workers sometimes on some of the largest boats. Think about all the transportation of the goods, the moving the goods back and forth from the docks to the boats. Think about how all this really stimulated all parts of the economy. Think about all the different things, building and maintenance and construction and workers. I mean, someone had to build all those ships, those huge ships. Think about what else was necessary, though. Engineering, mathematics, science. You had to have a whole industry of cutting down trees and lumber production and iron production to put all the nails and all the rivets holding the boats together. And this economic revolution, which covers China, it changed everything. It really did. So you got to think about how important. I mean, the fact that, remember, pictures paint 1,000 words, or pictures stand for 1,000 words, or whatever the hell the saying is. You know what I mean. What does it mean that someone took the time to paint this, sketch this? Why? What's the time? I mean, this is a lot of time and effort, artwork. I mean, it had to be significant. No one just paints randomness for nothing. Has to be a purpose in doing all this. Has to be that they're trying to portray an image of some sort. Is this propaganda? Is this purely art for art's sake? Was this something to show some lord and his prosperity and show that this is his market town and he built the bridges, the roads, the canals to show how great he is? All of this he created. You know, really, it's really interesting. Simply the creation of the artwork itself says a lot about things, says a lot about the economy and about the culture, that they would have taken the time and effort. And think about that too. That means there has to be people who are full-time artists who are doing this type of work, which means someone's paying them to do it. What does that say? Why don't they have to produce food? Well, why don't they have to produce food? You have to think about that. This is an interesting depiction of the economy, the entire system, the entire economic system, and all the different aspects of it. It's like a wheel and spoke. One thing you see in the image actually has so many connecting parts, so many different connecting parts. It's really interesting. It says a lot. All right, now we'll change gears here and look at the actual. We'll sort of zero in just on the Song Dynasty itself. So, the Song Dynasty. This dynasty was established about 50 years after the end of the Tang. After 50 years of civil war and internal conflict, when the Tang fell in 907. In reality, the Song really only ever controlled about half of China, the southern half. As the northern China never really ended its internal conflicts, the power struggles, and really northern China wasn't united until the Mongols arrived, and the Mongols united all of China, actually, under their rule in the 1270s. General Taizu, he was a common soldier, rises to the level of general. Eventually, he's elevated to the role of emperor of China in 960. His soldiers raise him to the level of emperor. Then immediately, to hinder the power of the military, he creates a system of government, a civil bureaucracy. It's kind of ironic. He uses the military to get himself in power, and then he does his best to actually curtail the power of the military. Probably for obvious reasons. He fears that someone else will use the military to overthrow him. So he uses the military to become powerful, and then tries to really limit the power of the military. Probably for fear of someone doing the same thing he did and taking his power from him. Smart, I suppose. Creates this system of civil bureaucracy to oversee the generals and the warlords all across the domain of southern China. He extends the civil service process we've talked about before, looking for intelligent, capable government leaders to run China's large bureaucracy. Again, it's a massive nation, even just southern China. So they need a large government, large bureaucracy, and that's what the civil service exam is really creates these leaders, or not creates, finds them, and then the government can train them, finds the capable, intelligent people who can run different parts of the government. Threats from the Lao, which are the northern Chinese nomads, generally in northern China. They were constantly attacking the Song dynasty, so they form a peace treaty with them eventually, with the agreement to actually pay them off. So the Song dynasty gives tribute to the northern nomads, the northern Chinese nomads, warriors, pays them off with gold and silk. Um, Even though these were probably Chinese people, these are not Mongolians, these aren't Mongols, these are probably what we think of as Chinese. Northern China is like a whole other country to southern China. So they simply pay them off to stop attacking them, to leave them alone. Still, China was the first country in the world to achieve a 1,000,000-man army, a million soldiers to defend its borders from the north and the west. China had massive borders. The borders of China would wrap halfway around the world. So, a lot of land to protect, a lot of borders to cover and protect and defend. So, you needed a 1,000,000-man army. Cost an incredible amount of money. Cost them dearly in money and revenue for pay, food, supplies, uniforms, all kinds of stuff to really pay for that massive amount of military to protect your borders. Constant attacks from the Lao. Well, the Lao and the Jurchen. Do I have them on here? Yeah, the Lao and the Jurchen. The Lao and the Jurchen, constant invasions in the 11th and 12th century, eventually bring down this dynasty as well. It lasts, around 300 years. It eventually is brought down, finally, by the Mongols in 1279. So it survived these invasions. It needed a massive military, but pretty much what they did is they spent all of their money, all their revenue, all their wealth, defending their borders, fighting off the barbarians, paying for a massive military. It simply wasn't sustainable. It simply wasn't sustainable for a very long period of time. It drained the country of all of its economic prosperity. So all the prosperity and wealth it was generating, instead of using it externally to spread its authority, to spread its power, to really colonize and look outside its borders, it had to spend all of its wealth and energy just defending its borders from all the outside influences. And it really drained the economy, it drained the country, and eventually the Mongols conquer northern China in the 1270s, and then they conquer southern China in 1279. The prosperity and the wealth generated made China a prime target for nomadic invaders, whether it's the Jurchen, the Lao, the Mongols, or others, the Uyghur Turks, whoever, it made them a target. And then they had to spend all that money and wealth that made them a target defending and protecting themselves. And it's a cycle that continued repeating over decades and centuries, and it's not a sustaining cycle. Eventually, you simply run out of money, run out of it, and you tire. You get tired generation after generation, year after year, you simply tire of it, and eventually it starts to fall apart. So East Asia 1000, East Asia 1200. You have Song China here early on. This was basically the beginning of Song China. Covered most of southern China, but not northern China. Northern China has got all kinds of invaders, the Uyghurs, the Lao, the Jurchens, and others. Then later, you've got 200 years later, towards the end of Song China, they've now had to contract. You see, they've lost all this territory. All this territory has been lost. They've lost land and territory. They've had to shrink down. Looks like they've lost, 20% of their territory to the invaders. Constant attacks. Simply can't hold it together, and eventually collapses with the Mongols come in and bring them down eventually. All right, so the scholar officials in Neo-Confucianism. We're going to talk a little more in detail about the Song culture here. This is a period of great intellectual achievement, created a foundation of what really becomes the modern Chinese government. This really creates the foundation of what does become the image and the function of the modern Chinese government. It starts with the examination system, the civil service examination system. Now, this was started by the Sui Dynasty centuries ago. We talked about it in previous chapters. But under the Song Dynasty, they expand it, they grow it. They have to have it for a massive bureaucracy to cover a huge territory, to have all of its government civil service leaders. They completely give away, they completely forget about any type of aristocracy. There's no aristocratic nobility class in China like we see in Europe, where they're the ones that are the lords and the nobles, and they pretty much run. There's rich and wealthy, but that's basically rich off of economic and merchant profit, not off of having land titles and land deeds and having lineage and inheritance and all this name value going back for years. It isn't that. It's really about money from the economic prosperity of China. Eventually, people who get it in part, who rule and govern China, are there because of intelligence, capability, good study habits, good education, and China becomes ruled by the best and the brightest. Pretty much anyone who's in charge has a good education, is usually part of the middle or upper classes, part of this ruling elite. As part of this, you have to study Confucianism. Confucianism, which goes all the way back to the BC, many, many years ago. So you have to study the Confucian classics. You have to know how to read, write poetry, politics, literature. It's expected to be a well-rounded person who has lots of culture and lots of knowledge. It's not really about science. It's really about what we might refer to as the liberal arts, the social sciences, if you will, that type of education, more of a liberal education, not really a science education. These people become part of this scholar official elite class. This is the educated elite, includes the scholars and officials who pass these competitive exams. They were deemed worthy of Chinese government and authority. For instance, in the year 960, there were perhaps 30,000 competitors. I just realized I actually have 30,000 there twice. I have 30,000,000. Technically, that would be a 30 million. So you can forget about the K there. It's just 30,000. So 30,000 competitors in 960. And by 1300, the number of competitors were perhaps 500,000. Competing for how many jobs? Maybe a couple thousand jobs annually. So a couple thousand jobs by the 1300s, 500,000 people competing for a few thousand jobs. Failure rate on the exams was over 90%. Don't get me wrong, even if you pass the exams, that doesn't mean you're chosen because you're still ranked. Once you pass the exams, then you're ranked. So only 10% passed. People study for years, 5, 10 years of study to pass these exams, and they would still fail. And even if you passed, that doesn't mean you were chosen. Why was this so important? This was literally the only way to the elite class, the upper class of society, unless you were a private entrepreneurial business person that was a self-made wealth. The only way to the upper class of society in China, it wasn't about being born, it wasn't about birth, nobility, aristocracy, it wasn't about family name. The only way to the elite, unless you are self-made rich, was through the civil service exams. Therefore, everybody who thought they could do it would do it, and at least try. It was incredibly significant. Um, Another thing which comes about in this time period is movable block printing. This is really the beginning of mass printing. It's not exactly the printing press Europeans do, but it's similar to where they have movable blocks that they can be moved in and out interchangeably, which allows them mass printing. Now, the first mass printing actually came out of Korea. China takes it, China improves it, if you will, and makes this mass printing movable block, movable type, to where each word or letter or each phrase was a different block that could be moved in and out, and then you could print it to make books or manuscripts or things like that. Why was it so important? Because education was now everything in Chinese society. This was the most educated, literate society on earth. So, to have education, you have to have books. You have to be able to disseminate and spread the knowledge. So, we see books being disseminated, we see a large educated class, literacy, and then, of course, through trade routes, this technology makes it out of China, makes it out to the rest of the world. And eventually, Europeans learn this. Mass printing eventually makes its way to Europe centuries later. Almost everything the Europeans did, they did secondhand or even third hand. That was pretty much happened other places first. They simply borrowed all this technology. For many upper middle class people, living the cultured life was expected. If you're middle upper class, you were supposed to be cultured, reading, writing, poetry, calligraphy, being able to write really stylistically. That's calligraphy. All of this was simply part of being a middle or upper class person in China. It was expected. Neo-Confucianism develops in the 11th century. It was a revival of Confucian thought. When is Confucius? Confucius dates all the way back to, I don't have it in my notes, but I think, 400s BCE, something like that? Somewhere around the 400s BCE. So we are looking back 14 centuries, maybe? So we're looking back 1400 years to this new version of Confucianism. It's amazing how influential Confucius was 14 centuries later, and they're still forming the government with this Confucian ideology. Although it's a new version of Confucianism, that's why it's called Neo-Confucianism, neo meaning new, this new version of it. It sort of counters the whole exam system. It's sort of a challenge to the exam system. The exam system was focused on very specific knowledge. Neo-Confucianism was the idea of a whole person, a whole well-rounded individual, not just someone who is entirely focused on basically passing tests. It's sort of like high school for many of you. Many of you have been through high school recently. You have those tests you have to take, those exit tests in 11th grade maybe. You're not really getting a whole rounded knowledge. You're training and you're learning how to take specific questions, to do specific things. It isn't necessarily about being a whole rounded individual. Neo-Confucianism focuses on that. Because a well rounded individual in all areas is more of a wise person, a more worldly knowledgeable person. You needed to study Confucius. It would bring you happiness. It would bring you understanding of the cosmos, understanding of the universe around us. Um, yeah. So in other words, just doing it for memorization, which is like what you do in high school, just trying to memorize stuff is not useful. You want to actually understand. You want to think about it. You want to analyze it. You don't want to just memorize facts and figures. You want to actually understand why things are occurring. So it requires more knowledge than just simply what we call rote memorization. Even in like history class like this, you may think you're doing that a lot of times. You're just rote memorizing things. But the idea is you also should be getting an idea of the concepts behind it. What are the concepts which sort of develop in society? Working class issues, cultural issues, political issues, uh, issues of war and strife, issues of education and knowledge. You want a more well-rounded education. You don't want to just memorize facts and figures. It's actually counterproductive, many people would argue. But Neo-Confucianism is more the well-rounded individual. They also sort of argued that this examination system it distorted the Confucian idea of Ren. Ren is humanity, being a good person to other people, and of course filial piety. Filial piety is where you take care of your neighbors, your friends, your family, your coworkers. Sort of the golden rule, if you will. Do unto others. Treat your neighbor the way you want your neighbor to treat you. Be nice to them, so they're nice to you. The expectation, that kind of thing. Um, the only way that really applied in this new society in China was among the scholar officials themselves. None of this really applied to the common agricultural farmers. And that is another issue with many Neo Confucianists. They believe that the society is getting so caught up with industrialization, economics, and with this scholar official system that we're forgetting what it is to be a human and a good person to each other. Everyone is just concerned with status and wealth and power. Yeah, really interesting. Um, Anytime you have any type of large social movement, which even though the scholar official system was initially designed to simply fill government jobs, it actually becomes part of the entire socio educational system in China. Everything is wrapped up with trying to become a scholar official. Well, whenever you have a large movement like that, ideological movement, there's always a counter. There's always counters to that. There are always people who resist it and argue there's another way, a better way. Doesn't mean it's better, doesn't mean it's worse, but they always argue that there's a counter way to do it. And we see that here with this. This is interesting. So we have here this image on a mountain path in spring, sorry. So what in this can you see that applies to either Neo-Confucianism or perhaps the scholar elite system? Think about that. What in this sort of applies to this new the way China operates now? Um, you have up here in the top, I know you probably don't read Chinese. Well, it's possible, a couple of you do, but this is a poetry. It's actually a poem up here in the right corner. So you have a poem up there. You have this elite person, this well upper class person sitting here looking off at nature, trees and woods and the mountains. This is a scholar here. This is one of these scholar elites. This might indicate what? What does this sort of indicate about him? What is this that says he's special? You notice back here, he has a servant following. He has a servant with him. What's the servant there for? Maybe to entertain him with music or something like that. If you read the actual poetry up there, it talks about harmony with nature, even power over nature. There's some talk in there about flowers and birds. It shows him very dignified. So, what is it about this that indicates need for the scholar elite system, this whole scholar system? What is it that indicates that it's so important, so prestigious? Why does everybody want to be one of these? Why do millions of people take the tests? Why do they spend years of their lives studying for this? You sort of translate it today. Think about, why do people spend 10 years or 15 years in college to get PhDs, or 10 or 15 years to become a doctor, a medical doctor, or 10 years or more to become a lawyer? Why do they do it? I think the answers are obvious. Why do people spend 5, 10, 15 years of their life in school to get these advanced, prestigious positions of lawyer, doctor, professor, um, things like this? Why do they do it? Uh, think about that. Now, Neo-Confucianism is a little more tense, a little more challenging with this. Any of this in this image that might reference Neo-Confucianism, maybe? Think about that. Is there any in this? Because Neo-Confucianism had some of the same ideas of the scholar system. It's almost like, think like a circle. The scholar elite system was half of the circle. Neo-Confucianism wanted to tack on the other half. So it isn't that it completely rejected the scholar system. It simply said you had to have this part of the circle, the scholar elite system, the scholar official system, but you needed the other half of it. So Confucianism, Neo-Confucianism doesn't completely reject the scholar system. It simply says that's only half the picture. You need to bring in the other half, more about humanity, caring for other people. Stop getting so much just in your head and also use your heart. So it's the head, it's like sort of the heart-mind connection. You need the whole picture, not just half. So are there elements in this that could actually lean towards Neo-Confucianism as well? Sort of the blending of the whole, not just half. Possibly. Think about this. Is he sitting in an office? Is he sitting at a desk? Is he reading a book? Is he in a government position right here? Does it show him actually? Is there any of this, that image that actually indicates he is an actual official in the government, even though the scholars would have been training to be in the government in a civil service position? So think about the elements of this that actually lean more towards Neo-Confucianism, not necessarily just the scholar official system. Think about that. Really good discussion question. A lot to talk about in this image about how this sort of addresses both parts of the ruling socio-cultural ideology of China, and how it sort of is all covered. How sort of all of it is in here. Really, it's very interesting. All right. Next thing we're going to talk about is women a little bit. We know much more about women in China starting in this period due to the spread of printing and sort of the mass production of. We do start to see mass production of books. One of the things, again, this is like 500 years before Europe does this. Half a millennia, 400 years at least, before Europe starts any type of mass printing. China was so ahead of the rest of the world. They were ahead of everyone else, leaps and bounds. Well, that actually allows us to know a lot more about women. Because in previous times, because writing was so limited, if writing occurred and people specifically were mentioned, usually it talked about men. But now that we have a proliferation of writing, we have writing and scripts and books and manuscripts, and we have plays and literature and poetry, women come up a lot more. So we know a lot more about women. Um, First of all, due to the increase of wealth, women could actually, or families could actually afford to keep their wives within the walls of the house, to keep their wives isolated from the rest of society. And women are expected to do women's work, women's tasks, weaving, sewing, tending of children, cooking, things like this. We see increasing isolation of middle and upper class women. Now, common women, agricultural women, they might be working in the farms, the rice fields, But among the middle and upper class, we see women completely kept out of society. They were not supposed to work or in any way labor. Marriages, typically arranged, common. The goal was to match families of equal social status and wealth, even using professional matchmakers. That was a career, a professional matchmaker in Chinese society, to ensure that the man and woman are from the same social class, the same rank, um, the same educational level. Obviously, if you were a scholar, elite official, you would not marry someone who was any type of anything less, any other type of job. So they tried to match them up. The bride would be given a dowry. The dowry given to her husband. We know how that is: jewelry, land, or clothes. Dowry is a system which we see across the entire world. We see this idea of a dowry as a common thing we see pretty much around the world. Land, jewelry, clothes, animals, things like this. And then, of course, the woman would then join her husband's family. And legally, she would now be part of the husband's family. She would no longer actually have any connection to her blood family, her actual blood connection. She is now, for all purposes, legally, for all intents and purposes, she is now a member of her new father in law's family. Wives were expected to have 5 or 6 children, and they were expected to have boys. Yes, I know. Boys were expected. Girls, we already talked about what happened to girls. Girls were not desired. If you had 5 kids, they wanted 4 of those to be boys. Wealthy husbands often had concubines. Concubines, sexual slavery, prostitution was common. There's even some historians that have gone so far as to say maybe in cities, 25% of all single women in cities were prostitutes. It was a huge industry. Prostitution was. Lots and lots of money available in the cities, and the men, single men as well as men who were married with families, it was perfectly acceptable for them to have prostitutes and concubines, and it was simply part of society. It was simply accepted. So, yeah, it was very common to have a second, third, fourth wife, even though only wife one is really matters as far as heirs. The only legitimate child was from the first wife, although having multiple wives was standard. It was a status thing. The more women you could support, the wealthier you were. Also very common. And then, of course, we get to the terrible, terrible, evil practice of foot binding. This becomes common during the Song Dynasty. This is when foot binding really begins. Young girls' feet, their feet was bound. We have an actual picture here. It's a real photo. Um, it's hard to even look at. It's specifically designed to inhibit the growth of the foot, to make it smaller, more dainty, they would actually wrap it up and deform the foot. You can look up pictures of these online, actual real, don't do it. I wouldn't do it. It's really disgusting. To make the foot look smaller and more dainty. And of course, it has the added practice. You can't work. You can't stand. You really can't have a job. So that was another thing. It was a status symbol. If you had your foot bound like that, that indicated you were upper status because you couldn't actually stand and have a job. You couldn't work. You couldn't actually do any type of labor. So higher status women would do this. They would continue this as adults. Um, this is seen as actually attractive. This is seen as sexually attractive, the dainty feet. Um, Over time, this spreads actually across all of China, and we actually even see it. We even see it spread into the lower classes. The common people actually start to do it. And this probably happens because in many sort of factory jobs, you sit at a factory job. You don't have to actually work in the fields. So we have many poor common people living in poverty, the commoners, but they work like a factory job. And the only time they have to actually walk is like from work and home and back. And then the rest of the time they sit either at home doing women's work or childcare, or they sit at work. So we actually see foot binding actually move into the common lower classes as well. Although it's less common. The lower economic status reduces the commonality of foot binding, but point being, we see it in all levels, at all parts of China, northern and southern China. And it doesn't really end until modern times. There are still women alive in the world that still have feet like this. So even within the last century, foot binding still occurred in China. So yeah, pretty crazy. Anyway, all right, we talked about the Mongols a little before. 1215, the Mongols invaded northern China. They took over northern China in the 1270s. It took them that long to finally conquer it. And then by 1279, they actually conquered the Song as well. So it took them the better part of a century, but still, in less than 100 years, the Mongols conquered all of China, the greatest geopolitical area in the world at the time, and they conquer it. As mentioned before, the Mongols kept separate. They generally kept their entire, they slept outside the cities. They had their own towns. They didn't intermarry. We sort of talked about that. They considered the Chinese people to be inferior. There's even times they considered slaughtering entire populations of Chinese so that they would have more places to graze their horses. They really thought nothing of Chinese people. They considered them inferior. This was a very distinct racism, have no doubt. This was ethnocentric thinking to where the Mongols were in all ways superior to Chinese. They considered the Chinese animals because the Chinese worked in the dirt, the mud, the water. They got filthy, they got dirty and sweaty and covered in animal, because they worked with the animals and the manure and the fertilizer. And the Mongols thought this was barbaric. It's weird. China, an advanced civilized society, and the Mongols, who are basically nomadic horse soldiers that have literally one city in their entire massive empire, they consider the Chinese to be barbaric because they worked and got dirty and filthy and worked in the mud and the dirt. It's really interesting. It's all about perspective, baby. It's all about perspective. Anyway, they were distinct societies that lived together for the better part of almost 2 centuries. The Mongols conquered and controlled China, and they lived side by side with Chinese people that they considered inferior in every way. The Mongols considered themselves elites. They were the elites, the soldiers, and pretty much the rest of Chinese society was inferior. They actually had more respect for foreigners because, of course, China was massive in trade, lots and lots of trade connections. The Mongols actually respected foreign merchants from other places in the world that actually traveled back and forth along the trade routes. They considered them to have higher status than the Chinese people themselves. Foreigners, complete strangers, even though the Mongols were ruling the Chinese. They really create a codified class system. This isn't quite like in India where you have a caste system. However, if this had remained, this goes away once the Mongols are eventually pushed out of China. The Mongols are eventually kicked out of China. Once this happens, things go back to the way they were before. But for the better part of a century, we see a very distinct class system develop that the Mongols created. They initiated this system. This ethnic system was really the social class entirely based on ethnicity, not necessarily skin color, but bloodline based upon ethnicity. They were at the top, they were the conquerors, and the different levels of Chinese were below that. And above the Chinese were actually pretty much any foreign people. So at the top were Mongols, foreign merchants and traders, whether it be from Persia or Asia or India, were considered the next status. And then the Chinese people themselves were actually at the bottom 2 statuses, the bottom 2 or 3 levels. Lots of restrictions. Chinese people couldn't take a name that was in any way similar to a Mongol. They couldn't marry into a Mongol family. They couldn't. There was even parts of China. Chinese people were not allowed to in any way deal with horses. They couldn't ride a horse. They couldn't get on a horse. They couldn't even have horses. Horses were entirely reserved just for the Mongols. Weapons. Yeah, Chinese people were not. It was an executable offense. If you ever found with a weapon of any sort in China and you weren't Mongol, you could be executed on the spot. Yeah. And what did the Mongols want out of China? I sort of covered this before. It's simply about money. They wanted money. They wanted wealth. They wanted all the money they could. This was simply about sucking up and absorbing all this economic prosperity that the Chinese had been growing for the last couple hundred years. Mongols wanted to suck it all out. They were wanted the money, the booty, the treasure, the wealth. That's all they really cared about. That's all they wanted. It was, of course, to their benefit to encourage trade. We actually see trade prosper under the Mongols because they were very respectful of the foreign merchants. Maybe not because they liked the foreign people. Maybe it was simply because foreign merchants represented dollar signs, or whatever the money was. They represented money, so maybe that's why they were respectful of the foreign merchants. Because the more merchants you have, the more buying and selling is going on, the more imports and exports, the more tax revenue, the more trade revenue. Merchants were simply walking money to the Mongols. Maybe that's why they respected them, gave them such high status. Um, that's what it was about. They did encourage this. Now, this does lead to problems, of course. First of all, the Mongols sometimes had a habit of destroying entire cities. I covered that before. They would sometimes literally burn down entire cities, killing every man, woman, child, animal, just to prove a point to the other cities. They burned down one, literally raze it to the ground, and then the other cities and the other surrounding cities would throw open their gates and say, "Please come in, Mongols. We'll do whatever you want. We'll give you whatever you want. Just don't literally kill every one of us." Um, so that, of course, hurts economic prosperity when you're burning, destroying cities. Kind of hard to build an economy around ruins. So that was a problem, of course. Of course, the Mongols didn't know how to run a large society like this. They had no way of learning or controlling or really, they weren't educated typically. The Mongols were not scholar elites. Most of them were illiterate. So they didn't know how to run a bureaucracy. They didn't know how to run a large empire like this. Uh, Also, during their time period, there's lots of wars. Of course, the Mongols are a warring people, so they burn crops, they burn forests, they kill animals. All of that is detrimental to the economy because the Chinese economy was based on agriculture. So if you're burning the fields and burning all the farmland and killing all the animals and murdering and enslaving all of the peasants, well, there goes your economy. I mean, people are going to starve to death. Millions of people died under Mongol rule, tens of millions by some calculations. These aren't ones the Mongols killed. The Mongols killed many. But by some calculations, as much as 20% of the entire Chinese population died under the Mongols due to their way they ran the society. They had they gave no value to human life other than their own. They valued no one other than Mongols themselves. They were brutal. They were terrorists. They were maybe the most violent, destructive people in the history of the world, maybe. Um, Possibly. We see population decline in the millions. We see constant warfare for the better part of the entire 13th century. The Mongols come into China in the early 1200s. It takes them almost 70, 80 years to conquer China. That whole time is warfare. So we have 50, 60, 70 years of constant warfare and violence, more than a normal human lifetime of constant war. Yeah, no wonder millions, maybe even tens of millions died. Not surprising. And yet, once they all get it together, and by 1368 it all collapsed. So this Yuan dynasty is really the Mongol dynasty. The Yuan dynasty is really when the Mongols ruled all of China, northern and southern, all of it together. And it survives 100 years. It takes them almost a century to conquer China, and then they hold it together for another 100 years, and then it collapses. All that death, all that misery, all that violence. I can't even begin to really describe how terrible this was. The Mongols are responsible as a people. They were responsible for killing more people than anyone until modern times. No one has done the type of mass destruction and misery and death brought on by the Mongol hordes than until modern times. Literally the last 50, 60, 70 years. We have never seen death on this scale, unnatural death on this scale, by human hands. I mean, the Black Plague killed more, but we're not talking about the Black Plague. We're talking about by human actual hands, by human machinations. Nothing like this until modern times and the world wars. It's crazy. All right, we're going to shift gears to China. This is really the end of the chapter, so we'll talk about China here a little bit. All right, Japan. Japan's Han period, 794 to 1185. Japan was heavily influenced by its, I don't know, big sister, if you will, the big sister, China. Japan and China have been tied together for centuries, millennia even. Both have influenced each other. Influenced by Chinese culture, writing, government, language. Lots of similarities there. Almost all of ancient China really owes its roots, pardon me, almost all of ancient Japan pretty much owes its roots to China. Uh, yeah, just about all aspects of Japan can actually be traced to Chinese culture. However, in this period, we see Japan beginning to try and separate itself from its big neighbor, its big sister, brother, whatever, try to seek total independence. It does achieve it eventually. It does achieve independence. Um, in the Han period, the capital was also called Han. That was actually the capital of China as well. Today, that is what is modern day Kyoto. Modern day Kyoto. This was modeled on a Chinese city. It looked like Chinese city, Chinese culture, Chinese structure, Chinese architecture. The ruling authority in this period was the Fujiwara family. The dynasty reached its peak under the warlord Fujiwara Michinaga. This was a warlord. This was a warring society. Pardon me. This was a society based upon authority and dominance of warlords. Not like in China, where it was really about scholar, elite officials. It was about education and elitism, best and brightest. In Japan, this was rule of might of the sword. This was rule of the sword. Japan was ruled primarily by warlords. He was a father, uncle, grandfather of many numerous royal leaders over the next century. He really starts a dynastic line over the next 100 years, which is pretty much his family, this Fujiwara family, which rules China for, well, close to a century. Key here is they ruled from behind the scenes. Because during all this time, there was an actual emperor. There was an emperor sitting on the throne. But the Fujiwara family are the ones that actually controlled the government from behind the scenes, pulling the strings, if you will. The Japanese emperor was considered a figurehead. Now, don't get me wrong, I say that differently. They say it differently. The Japanese emperor was a figurehead, although most common people considered him the true power of Japan. The reality was he was no actual power. The Fujiwara family had all the power. He was a figurehead with no real authority, even though to the people he appeared to have authority. The patriarchal male leader of the Fujiwara family actually ran society. Now, in an effort to counter the Fujiwaras, some emperors actually abdicated. In other words, they gave up the throne, they placed their sons on it, and then they tried to exercise power through their sons while hiding in the background. This is similar to what the Fujiwaras did, but they were trying to compete with the Fujiwara family. In other words, the father steps down, puts his son in charge, and then he tries to influence his son, the same way the Fujiwaras tried to influence him. And we see this happen multiple times. This is what we call a cloistered government. To where we have, whether it's the Fujiwaras or the family member behind the scenes, you have the person on the throne who actually appears to the masses of people to be the ruler, but in reality has no power whatsoever. And all the power is actually held behind the scenes by a close family member or an actual family, in the case of the Fujiwaras, who actually run everything. It's really interesting how this works. this is not a one-off. I mean, because this happened in Europe sometimes. Like a young boy would come and be crowned king. His father would die, and an 8-year-old boy would be king. Who would actually run the government while the boy was growing up was usually a regent, a uncle, or the mother, or for instance, who'd actually really be running things because an 8-year-old boy doesn't know anything about being a king. So they would actually rule things from behind the scenes. But usually, when the boy grew up and became an adult, he would then become the full on king. Kings in European society had real power. The real authority in the government was often the king himself. I mean, he's the one who actually made all the decisions to go to war, to kill, to do all the stuff. He signed all the decrees. In China, though, this actually became a tradition for over 200 years to where the emperor really it was simply by design. The emperor never was meant to have power. It was simply a figurehead sort of to inspire the population. But everyone who knew the things behind the scenes knew that there was actually a government running behind the scenes actually doing all the stuff. The emperor was just to make it look good. And it was sort of designed this way after a while. This becomes common practice in Japan, even into modern times. In case you're unaware, Japan today even technically has an emperor um, with no power. The emperor is a figurehead, has no actual authority, really, in modern times in Japan. So this becomes the tradition in Japan. Different because even in China, which they have an emperor at different times, usually the emperor in China has actual power. There are times it's a figurehead, but the emperor in China often has power. Um, but for most of the last millennia, not all the time, of course, but most of the last millennia, Japanese emperors really are entirely figureheads, and it's by design this way. Really interesting how it works that way. All right, aristocratic culture is another thing to talk about. We see an aristocratic culture, which is generally for the upper class, those with wealth and status. So we see the aristocratic culture disappear in China. It's replaced by these scholar officials. There is no aristocratic elite family culture. But we saw that in Europe, of course, and we actually see it in Japan. We see this aristocratic elite. Japan's feudalistic society actually looks very much like Europe. Kings and lords and emperors and nobles and aristocrats and a hierarchical system. It's all about family name and lineage. Really, Japan looks much more like Europe's medieval system than China's medieval system. Much more like it. They can have a idea of refinement and pleasure and fine garments and fine poetry and writing. This whole genteel is not the right word to use. This whole refined elite system, upper class system. Well, while this aristocratic culture applies mostly to men, we actually see some women enjoying it too. We actually see increased female rights in the Han period here in Japan. We see women having more authority at all levels of Japanese society. Women could be educated in arts, culture, poetry, literature, writing. Um, you could actually gain status by marrying an emperor, marrying a lord. A lord is what they would call a shogun. Do I even have that on the slide here? I don't have it. A lord in Japanese society is what we call a shogun, shogun. And so you can marry a shogun, which would be a lord. You could write poetry. Females wrote history books, biographies, great texts. For instance, a great text, The Tale of Genji, somewhere around the year 1000 to 1010, which is a story about love and life and loss in the royal court of the emperor. Really interesting stuff. I'll move over here and see that photo in case you want to see a picture. Yeah. So we see female intellectuals, females could inherit property, females could run businesses. Yeah. Don't get me wrong, most women didn't enjoy this opportunity. This opportunity usually was for higher status. But even in other societies, higher status women often are not given opportunities, especially in a feudalistic society, which is what this medieval society is feudalistic, sort of like what it is in Europe. even upper class women are still considered inferior. Um, upper status women here, upper class women here actually have quite a few opportunities, more so than in many societies. Buddhism was the most common religious practice in Japan at the time. It was borrowed from China, Buddhism in China. Buddhist texts were often brought to brought to Japan from China. One of the more famous ones is Sacho. Sacho in 804, he actually comes over and starts growing and spreading Buddhism. He's sort of a Buddhist prophet, becomes a Buddhist leader in Japan, starts this whole new branch of Buddhism known as Tendai Buddhism. We even start creating, let's see if I have it on here. I don't. They even start creating these monk soldiers, these soldier monks, to where you would practice and train the martial arts. And I don't mean karate here, although that would apply as well. When you think martial arts today, when you hear that term, you think of jujitsu and karate and kickboxing and things like that. Well, martial arts technically simply refers to any type of weapon training. Technically, any type of martial training, which is weapon warfare training. We use it more specifically to refer to karate or things like that today, but truthfully, actually, any type of military war training is a martial art. So, Tendai Buddhists often trained as martial artists, using weapons, things like this. And they become sort of guards in many areas. They would guard castles, they would guard monasteries. We even see a couple different times, we even see Japanese emperors hiring the Tendai Buddhist warriors to guard them as sort of, I suppose you might translate as sort of like our Secret Service today, guarding the president. They were specifically trained to guard and protect the emperor. Really interesting how we often think of Buddhism as a form of peace and prosperity and calmness and meditation, not violence. And yet, these were Buddhist monks which actually trained to be violent, to be warriors. Although they were training not to be offensive warriors, not to go and fight wars, they were trained to be defenders, to protect the other monks, to protect the defenseless people. So it's more of an honorable, noble profession, we might think of that way. Really interesting how this martial version of Buddhism forms. Kind of interesting. All right, and I believe this is our last. This is our last thing. So Japan was a militaristic society, maybe the most militaristic society on earth at this time period. Truthfully, their entire culture, their socioeconomics, their government was ruled by warlords, ruled by daimyo, ruled by different types of lords, shoguns. It was rule of the might. It really was rule of the sword. Uh, the Han warrior class really comes to power in this time period. This is really the birth of the samurai, which we often associate that with Japanese society. It wasn't always that way. This is really the birth of this militaristic Japanese martial society that we see. These warriors were often known as samurai. They served as military warriors. They owed allegiance to their lords. Their lords could be a daimyo. Uh, there's different ranks of lords in Japanese society, just like you see in Europe. You see these different ranks. In Europe you have kings and lords and princes and dukes and what other? There's all other kinds of ranks, earls and dukes and whatnot. Well, these are a couple of those ranks. You have daimyos and shoguns, and there's probably other ranks in there too. So the lords are these daimyos and shoguns. Shoguns were usually more towards the top, higher level. Shoguns could actually rise all the way up to like being a king or an emperor even. So they were sort of like European knights. They were expertly trained in bows and swords and used horses, all kinds of different weapons. They wore heavy armor. Over several centuries, we see civil wars breaking out all across Japanese society. and it is rule of the sword. It's rule of might. Eventually, we get one leader. At the end of the Han period, we get one leader come to dominate all the others. Shogun Yoritomo. Shogun Yoritomo becomes simply known as the Shogun. Effectively, he's the king. He becomes dominant over all of Japanese society. This ushers in what we call the Kamakura Shogunate. The Kamakura family and the Shogunate, meaning it's like a kingdom under the shogun of almost, 150 years. Samurai were expected to live according to the code of Bushido, which is a code of conduct very similar to like the code of chivalry in America. The code of chivalry in Europe, this code of chivalry that knights had to uphold, which is sort of false. Most knights didn't actually uphold the code of chivalry. It was this ideal that most knights claim they could live up to, and yet we know very few actually did. However, the code of Bushido was different. This was the chivalric code for the Japanese, of which almost all warriors actually did abide by. It wasn't this false sense of this ideal code of honor that we see in Europe, where most knights did not ever achieve. In Japanese society, most samurai did achieve the level of Bushido. They did achieve this code of honor and respect. This stoic acceptance of hardship, loyalty, honor, courage. Honor was probably the most important way of the warrior. Probably the most important code was the honor and being respected and giving respect to those that deserved it. And if you lost your honor, the only thing you could do was seppuku. That was it. If you ever lost your honor and you were dishonored, you had no option but to kill yourself. That is seppuku. It's pretty bad too. It's pretty terrible. And it wasn't instant death either. You actually used you had two different swords. You had the longer sword here, which is a samurai, and then you had the shorter one, which was, I think, known as a wakizashi, which is the shorter sword. You would actually pull your short sword, stick it in one side of your gut, and run it across your entire gut, spilling out your entire innards onto the ground. And usually you didn't die immediately. Usually it took you a little bit to die. I would imagine unbelievable amount of pain. That is the only way to restore your honor very often. Yeah. So if you ever lost your honor, you ever lost your way of Bushido, there really was no option but death. Yeah. All right. So Yoritomo, who founded the Kamakura Shogunate, he ruled by appointing aristocrats. He creates a military state, putting military governors in place. This becomes a military state, and it becomes the it basically becomes the format for Japanese society for the next 5 centuries, to where Japanese society is generally run, even in more modern times, even in coming centuries where we get weapons and gunpowder and stuff like this. Generally speaking, for the next 500 years, Japan is ruled as a military state with warlords, shoguns, etc. This becomes the common way of Japanese society for several centuries. The shogunate is a military state run by the shogun, his loyal samurai, his loyal daimyo, and they have the power. Even though there's still an emperor, there's usually still an emperor, but the emperor is totally a figurehead with no power. Now, after Yoritomo dies, his wife, a member of the Hojo family, she has to accept her family as the leading power, and the Hojo family pretty much runs the country from behind the scenes, running the family behind the emperor scenes, just like before. So now we have an emperor in charge, and a family is behind the scenes again. A cloistered government continuing on. This becomes very common in Japanese society. The Hojo rulers actually stopped the Mongols in 1274. They stopped the Mongols again in 1281, organizing the entire Japanese society in a defense of the island and islands. They sink the Mongol ships. The Mongols could not defeat the Japanese. Now, if they'd ever somehow managed to get their entire horse army over there, yes, they would have probably overrun the island. but they never did. They never were able to do that. The Japanese are really the only culture that stopped the Mongols. I can't think of any other culture that actually was able to stop and resist the Mongols. Now remember, even in Europe, the only thing that stopped the Mongols from conquering Europe was mud. That's it. Once they got stuck down in the wet Central European area with all the mud and the mountains, they simply couldn't get to the rest of Europe. Their horses, if the horses couldn't get there, the Mongols couldn't get there. So what really protected Japan here? Japan did organize to stop the Mongols, but truly it was the water that slowed them down and limited their forces. If they had a land bridge to somehow get to China, to Japan, they would have used their entire army and probably done it, conquered it. Eventually, the shogunate collapses, as they all do in 1333, due to war, violence, and eternal strife. Don't they all? You see the Mongol invasions here. These are the actual Mongol invasions from Korea into China. You have the Kamakura leader here, the Han leader here. All right, well, that's pretty much it. It was fun. Thanks for going with me this time period of 800s to 1400 of Eastern Asia. Take care.